There were two different golden ages of Canadian foreign policy, one that was golden for certain diplomats, one that was golden for certain students of Canadian foreign policy. There's a lot we can learn from those periods, particularly in terms of the less partisan approach to foreign policy, the more collaborative approach to foreign policy, the greater interest in world affairs that was shown by Canadians. Through the life of John Holmes, I think we'll be able to learn a lot about that. So the question of the day is the golden age of Canadian foreign policy behind us? And the shortest answer to the question is two words: yes, but. The slightly longer version, which will form the framework for the rest of what I'd like to say today, is as follows. I understand there to be what you could consider two golden ages of Canada's foreign policy past. It's very important to understand and learn from them, even if getting back to the spirit of either period wouldn't necessarily be a good thing. It's not that these ages were golden for everyone. I'll suggest that they were both golden for some people. It's not necessarily something we would want to go back to. Nevertheless, we need to learn from them and understand their spirit. And using John Holmes' life to do this will make a lot of sense to you as I tell you his story. So let me begin with just a little bit of historical context about Holmes. For close to 50 years, beginning in the early 1940s and when he first joined what was the Canadian Institute of International Affairs, till his death in 1988, John Holmes played a leading role, a truly leading role, in the development and interpretation of Canada and its place in the world. And he thus personified the elements of these two golden ages that I'm going to tell you about. Those of you who knew Mr. Holmes or who have read Mr. Holmes' work will still recall, undoubtedly, his remarkable abilities as a diplomat, an essayist, a historian, a commentator, a university professor, and a mentor for many. In spite of the impact that he had, and I will suggest to you that it was tremendous, Holmes' name no longer resonates with the average Canadian or even with with students of Canadian foreign policy in their first course, the way that it might have in the 60s and 70s when he was a frequent commentator on television and in the newspapers. And although for me this is quite disappointing, it's also, from my perspective as a historian, not particularly surprising. To me, when we analyze, or generally when world affairs in Canada and Canadian foreign policy is analyzed today, most people tend to take what I'd call too presentist of an approach. In other words, we hear and we tend to believe that Canada faces challenges today that are nothing like those that we've ever faced before in this country. The world is more complex. This is the word that I hear every day at the Canadian Forces College when we have guests come in to speak to our students about strategic governance and decision making. As a result of this more complex world, I hear every day we need new solutions, new approaches, and new ways of understanding our globalized world. If the world is that different, it would follow that the experiences and thinking of a man who passed away not only before 9/11, but before the Cold War even ended, would have little to teach contemporary students of Canadian foreign policy and Canada and world affairs, even if he did come from an era that is characterized as this golden period of our time. And at one level, such skeptics of people who study people like Holmes wouldn't be wrong. The challenges of today are certainly different. And a revolution in communications technology certainly has resulted in what historians have also often called the acceleration of history. Things do change more quickly than they used to. People who seek to threaten our security do have more options than they've ever had before. They can organize themselves more easily than they could in the past. So I don't deny that the time when Holmes' name could be found in newspapers, magazines, academic publications across Canada and indeed around the world was a different one. And I will not suggest at any point that we can simply turn back the clock or even try to turn back the clock to return to a time that many considered so exceptional. Nor would I suggest that we even should. But I do want to preface my comments by suggesting that much of the international context is not as different as contemporary analysts make it out to be, and that as a result, Holmes' insights on contemporary issues in Canadian foreign policy remain valuable today to foreign policy analysts and to practitioners. So to make clear the remarkable similarities between the past and today, let me begin with an anecdote that took place during Holmes' junior years as a civil servant in the 1940s. Just 2 years after he joined the Department of External Affairs, John Holmes and Lester Pearson were leaving the Hotel Savoy in London when they noticed a news bulletin. Back then in the 1940s, if you wanted to know the news without television or much else, there were bulletin boards in every hotel at the front. News was posted there. They walk by, they read the news bulletin, and it informs them of the detonation of the world's first atomic weapon in Hiroshima. Political scientists studying that would call that day a paradigm shift. They'd argue that members of the international community, by entering the nuclear era, or the atomic era, changed everything. The world changed basically at a snap of a finger. The challenges that were introduced to policymakers that day were overwhelming. And I'd argue that the impact of the development of foreign policy on that day was hardly less significant than the impact of 9/11 more recently. The ability to be flexible, the ability to adapt to changing international circumstances, the ability to manage the unexpected, skills that we see as so necessary today, are therefore all skills that Holmes needed and indeed had 70 years ago. The challenges were just as great. Given the events of the last decade, the lessons that Holmes learned and passed on to more than one generation of Canadians from all walks of life, whether representative of a golden age or not, are therefore all the more relevant and worth recalling than they ever have been. So as I mentioned at the beginning, for the purposes of what I'm going to say today, let's consider there to have been two golden ages. And again, neither was golden for everyone. And as a result, there's no reason to yearn for the past. But both were absolutely golden for some. The first period, the 1940s and 50s, during which time John Holmes was an up-and-coming and then a leading diplomat in the Department of External Affairs, was golden for Canada's diplomatic corps. It was golden for the diplomats. The second, which took place in the 1960s and into the 1970s, during which times Holmes was leading what's now the CIC, the CIIA, the Canadian Institute of International Affairs, was golden for a good portion of students of Canadian foreign policy, not necessarily just those in school, but those who wanted to learn about Canada and its place in the world. It was a time when an unusual proportion of Canadians seemed interested in international affairs, and even more, an unusual proportion seemed open to even-handed, level-headed thinking about Canada and its place in the world. So to set the context for what I'm calling the first golden age, the golden age that was much more golden for the diplomats than anyone else, let me quote for you from a memorandum drafted in 1943 by Britain's then High Commissioner to Canada, Malcolm MacDonald. He called it "Some Thoughts on the Post-War Position of the British Commonwealth of Nations." And here's what he wrote. "We have underrated Canada's quality in the past. I believe that the strength and the wisdom of her contribution in international discussions and actions after the war will surprise us. The fact is that Canada has grown up over the last few years, despite all of her internal difficulties. She has found herself. Some of her ministers have marked ability. There is also in Ottawa a group of high officials who are still comparatively young, mostly in their early or mid-40s, and whose influence over Canadian polity is, and will continue to be, at least as important as that of the ministers, whose tenure of office is more precarious. They are the heads of government departments and other official bodies. They are able, enlightened, and forceful. If we do not discourage them, but on the contrary encourage them as well as their ministers to be our colleagues in affairs, we shall find them good allies." So who were these diplomats that MacDonald was talking about? Well, let me take the opportunity to tell you about one of them who personified much of what was best about all of them, John Wendell Holmes. Holmes was born in London, Ontario, June 18th, 1910. He was the second of 4 children. He was brought up in a household that was fairly standard for a smaller city in Ontario at the time. His parents stressed the social gospel and the importance of family. Family had close ties, or felt close ties, to the British Empire. Wendell Holmes, the father, was a bookseller. Helen ran the household. Their only son, John, then known as Jack, attended public schools and was the obvious choice of the 4 in the 1920s, when there was 1 boy and 3 girls, to be the one who got to go to university. He attended the University of Western Ontario. At this point, the story becomes much less typical. Like many of his future diplomatic colleagues, John Holmes was truly exceptional. Class president upon his arrival at Western, top grades in English and history throughout his career as an undergraduate, valedictorian when he graduated in 1932, an extensive extracurricular pedigree that included a term as the editor of the university newspaper, the Gazette. He was really a natural leader in absolutely every way. He completed a master's degree in history at the University of Toronto, and he hoped to pursue a PhD abroad, but facing the economic challenges of the Great Depression, and without a major scholarship to support him, he changed his plans. Holmes taught English for 5 years at Pickering College, which is a private boys' school about an hour's drive north of here. just outside of Newmarket. The school was what I call radically progressive. What I mean by that, it was the first school in Ontario to abolish capital punishment. When you learnt geography at Pickering College, they took you outside, gave you a compass, and asked you to figure out where you were. Radically progressive. This was a good place for John Holmes, who himself at the time had been radically progressive. He had revitalized the League of Nations Society when he was at Western. He'd promoted global disarmament quite aggressively while he was there. It didn't take long at Pickering for everyone to realize that he was a natural teacher. And he was well regarded by his students and deeply missed when he left 5 years later, in 1938, having saved up enough money to pursue doctoral education at the University of London. Holmes's PhD plans began, but then were cut short by the Second World War, and specifically the attacks on London, which led to his return to Canada in 1940. By this time, he was already a published author. His experience at Western as the editor of the Gazette had gotten him in contact with a number of people at major publications. He published articles in Saturday Night Magazine in Canada and Toronto. So he was already a published author. He'd served as the Canadian foreign policy expert in his Commonwealth study group, and for all intents and purposes, given the number of Canadian foreign policy experts there were at the time, that made him one of the 5 or 10 experts in the world on this issue. With those two things together, it made perfect sense for John Holmes to be drafted to the CIIA as the manager of the new Library and Publications Program. So let me see a little bit about the Institute, which is now the Council, to give you a sense of the Institute at the time. As James mentioned, it was founded in 1928 as a discussion forum for citizens interested in what at the time they said was the empire and world affairs. Over its first decade, branches such as this one were established across the country, and they served as hosts to speaker series just like this one and study sessions. Not that much, in many ways, has changed. The Institute was and remains nonpartisan. It drew its members, as it still does, from the private sector, the media, the public service, less from the media today. Government officials, and this is something that's at least a little bit different than the past, were in very close contact with the Institute's leadership. It was not uncommon to see political representatives at the Institute's meetings and conferences and taking part in major CIIA events. CIIA members had diverse views, but they did seem to share a common belief that Canada had a role to play in world affairs. And collectively, although they had their different views, they believed that to play that role and to make the hard choices that would inevitably come from involvement in complicated and complex international issues, all Canadians had to have a better understanding of the world around them. So the CIIA was dedicated to fostering greater public dialogue about foreign policy among informed Canadians, and also to increasing the interest in such issues among the general public. So it sort of had an elite mandate and a popular mandate as well. Holmes moved up in the Institute very quickly. He became the CIA's Permanent Information Secretary in 1941, and its National Secretary, which is basically the equivalent of a president or a CEO, shortly after that. He was noticed. The Institute was very important at the time. Major actors in the Institute were known across the country, particularly in Ottawa. And he was recruited to 2 different parts of the federal government. The Wartime Prices and Trade Board wanted him, as did the Department of External Affairs. Holmes made what for Canada and for him was the right choice by joining External in 1943, and very quickly came to appreciate what one diplomat at the time called the facts of life in the Foreign Service, a series of ideas that fostered a tremendous pride and commitment among the public servants of the time. So when we start talking about golden, this is the type of thing that I'm talking about. So I'd like to quote to you from Holmes's first office mate, Marcel Cadieux, who went on to become what we call today the Deputy Minister. Diplomats, in some respects, continue to be civil servants of a special kind. They must carry out their duties in conditions which impose upon them a need to be well informed, to serve with distinction, to represent their country appropriately. Personal and professional worth, an ability to represent the various cultural elements of the country, an attachment to democracy, a sense of the practicable. These are all components characteristic of the image of our diplomatic officers, as conceived by the department. So diplomacy was without question an elite profession in Canada. I'm fairly certain, although I haven't crunched the numbers, that the Department of External Affairs had the highest concentration of Rhodes Scholars of any organization in the country. This was the place that you went to after you won your Rhodes Scholarship. There was largely a selfless commitment among these people, who could have earned higher salaries elsewhere, to help create this reputation for Canada in the world that was very strong in the 40s and 50s. Holmes himself was mentored by basically the three strongest, most senior and powerful mandarins: Hume Wrong, Norman Robertson, and Lester Pearson. They were uniformly impressed by his work ethic. It's actually, historians love to look through personnel records from years and years ago just to see what the gossip was at the time. And in fact, it's quite funny to see the three senior deputy and assistant deputy ministers in a department arguing over who gets John Holmes next, arguing that they actually have a better job for him than the others. And they would go back and forth on this repeatedly. They loved his work ethic. They loved his analytical ability. They loved his people skills. And he was promoted through the ranks at a crazy pace. Within 8 years in the department, he was ranked higher than most people who had been there for at least 20, paid more as well. Holmes' association with the big three also meant that most of his initial foreign policy experiences took place on the most significant files. So Holmes was Hume Wrong's secretary on the post-hostilities planning group, tasked with devising a Canadian approach to the future world order. The post-hostilities planning group was the first time in Canadian history that the government had actually sat down and thought seriously about what it wanted from its foreign policy, about what it wanted Canada to do in the world. Holmes was in the middle of that. He attended more meetings of that group than anyone else. And this is what he said about the meetings afterwards when he was asked to reflect on it, and I'll quote for you. "Building the infrastructure of international collaboration may be boring, but let us not forget that it should be the purpose of all peace lovers to make the world more boring." He collaborated with Norman Robertson on strategic political issues when Robertson was posted as High Commissioner to Great Britain. And because Lester Pearson for many of these years was in politics, Holmes got his greatest training from Lester Pearson once Pearson left Foreign Affairs and moved into politics as the Secretary of State for External Affairs, today the Foreign Minister in 1948. Pearson basically took Holmes with him as his senior advisor for nearly the entire time. It was Holmes who accompanied Pearson to Moscow in 1955. It was Holmes who was the senior diplomatic advisor during the Suez Crisis, which led to Pearson's Nobel Prize in 1956. It was Holmes who was on the airplane with Pearson on the way to New York before the Suez Crisis. It was Holmes who was sketching an idea of this peacekeeping force on a napkin on their seats as they were on their way. And it was Holmes who Pearson often took to baseball games in the 40s and 50s. And you might ask, well, why does that matter? Well, just like athletes like to warm up, Pearson believed that if you were going to think strategically, you had to warm up your mind. So and Pearson loved baseball. So he would go to baseball games, not actually to watch the game, but to discuss the coach's strategy. The right fielder's been moved 7 feet to the left. The center fielders come in a little bit. And he'd tell Holmes what was going on. Holmes didn't care anything about baseball. But he'd tell Holmes, and basically what he was doing was rehearsing the way he was going to think when they discussed strategic Canadian political issues afterwards. It was always Holmes who came to these things. Holmes was Canada's senior representative in the Soviet Union in 1947 and 48, when the Cold War broke out, became more threatening. He was at the United Nations as the representative from Ottawa when the Korean War started. He was responsible for the management of the early years of Canada's contribution to the International Commissions on Supervision and Control in Vietnam. And through all of these experiences, he developed what I'd call a distinctly Canadian approach to world affairs. It was a functionalist way of thinking derived primarily from one of his mentors, Hume Wrong. Canada was not a great power, Holmes understood, but nor was it unimportant. Rather, it had the capacity to contribute to world affairs on select issues based on its level of expertise and its willingness to make a substantive and respectable, with respectable being the key word, commitment. This is how Holmes explained it. "In the long run, we haven't got much but our moral influence in a hard world," he once said. "And if we have told too many people off, they just aren't going to listen to us." 1954, Holmes gave a speech to the Canadian Army Staff College in Toronto that explained Canadian foreign policy as being based on 6 principles. 65 years later, I'd suggest to you that not very much has changed. It's therefore worth hearing what he had to say then. First, he said, Canada first, but not Canada alone. In other words, to promote Canadian interests, Canada had to be willing to help preserve the peace outside of the continent. Second, because Canadians relied disproportionately on foreign trade to drive their economy, it was important to maintain open trade routes, stable international financial institutions, and civil relations with potential trading partners. Foreign trade mattered, and it mattered more to Canada than it did to others. Number 3, foreign policy could not be hostile to American interests. This doesn't mean that Canada couldn't disagree with the United States. It's that it couldn't disagree violently to the point that it weakened the United States, because weakening the United States did not serve Canada strategically. Number 4, even though the United States was so important, it was also important to maintain counterweights to American domination. The 1950s, for Holmes, that meant maintaining a strong relationship with the United Kingdom and a particularly strong relationship with the Commonwealth. Throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s, Holmes was extremely disappointed that the Commonwealth lost status and power in the world. He felt that it was unbelievably helpful for Canada to have membership in an international organization that had a degree of stature that didn't have the United States in it. That the Commonwealth was unbelievably in Canada's best interest, and he was always disappointed with Canadian political leaders who ignored the Commonwealth. Point 5, external affairs could not divide Canadians along ethnic, linguistic, cultural lines. National unity mattered in Canada, just like it matters in basically any democracy. And number 6, Canada's approach to global politics had to recognize both the potential and the limitations of a medium-sized power. On this last point, Holmes explained it as follows to the group in 1954. It doesn't mean, of course, that we should just sit in the back row and look holy, or commit that unfortunate error of just telling other people that they should follow our lead and learn perfect peace. There is, in fact, a role which we can play and which we have played with success. It is the role of responsible member of the world community, willing to provide his good offices if they can be used as a mediator or moderator or just a thinker-upper of practical solutions. So on the whole, what was so golden about this period during which Holmes was a leading member of the diplomatic team? First, I'll concede, it was more than just the diplomats. In fact, there are 4 factors that I think are worth noting. The first one is international circumstances. Because of the destruction of Europe during the Second World War, Canada was temporarily, and temporarily being the key word, disproportionately powerful by virtue of its healthy economy and wartime military machine. It had a major ally, the United States, that for a brief period in the 1940s was extremely interested in working with its allies. The Americans were profoundly multilateralist in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And it was also a time on the international stage where foreign ministries were disproportionately important. In other words, there was summit diplomacy, diplomacy of the heads of government, but they were dealing with post-war issues. They weren't dealing with diplomatic issues beyond post-war, largely military things. They left the foreign services in charge of that. Canada had good foreign service. So you put all those things together, the temperature of the times was conducive to a country like Canada. Second factor that made the period golden, the domestic political environment. Foreign policy was developed by experienced politicians. Canada had had the same party in office for over 10 years. Exceptional public servants. And it was developed in a largely nonpartisan manner. We had something in the mid to late 1940s that made it easier to do foreign policy. Everyone agreed that there were good guys and bad guys. The communists were bad. Quebec believed the communists were bad. Alberta believed the communists were bad. And everyone in between believed the communists were bad. The Conservatives believed the communists were bad. The Liberals believed the communists were bad. And even the CCF didn't have that many good things to say about the communists. What that meant is that we didn't have any fights on piddly little issues because we were all working to the same long-term goal. Everyone had the same goal in mind. Public servants were relatively well paid, and they got along extremely well in large part because they had the same cultural and educational backgrounds. They were absolutely elitist. They were mostly unilingual English speakers. They were Protestant, almost exclusively. They were all middle to upper middle class, save the exceptional one here and there. They had a collective distaste for record keeping. No one kept papers of anything in order. They hired people to do that. They were poorly suited for the professionalization of the public service that has taken place since. Their elitism made them poorly suited for the democratization of foreign policy that has taken place more recently. They would not have been comfortable necessarily with the outreach that is made today to involve all of the public. They like to do things alone. They believe they did it very well. They did actually do it quite well. But that isn't to say that we should necessarily go back to doing it that way. That's why it was golden for them. If you were not a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, upper middle class, brought up with the social gospel, and you were interested in Canadian foreign policy, it was not a golden time for you. If you were a woman, it was not a golden time for you either. This was not a golden time for everyone. But for that group, it absolutely was. Number three, third reason, popular attitudes at home. The Canadian public was a wonderful combination, if you take this elitist approach, of supportive of foreign policy, which meant that the government could feel relatively free to do what it wished, and not interested in the details. Canadians should be doing something in the world. That was what the public said. They left it to everyone else to figure out what to do. Trust in the political establishment, both in politicians and in the public service, was dramatically higher than it was now. That allowed people to make difficult choices. It allowed people to take risks that most of our leaders are afraid to take today. Number four, the national media was also fairly collectively internationalist in their outlook and committed to reporting on policy much more than they were on politics. The era of gotcha journalism begins around 1954, 1955, at least in Canada. From 45 to 53, 54, the major journalists are the people that Pearson leaks to. They're the people that are attending the conferences of the CIA. They're the people who are writing reports for the CIA. There is this one community working together towards a common cause. Again, do we want to repeat this? Do we want the media to be that close to the political establishment? Probably not. Not all that healthy. But being rid of the gotcha journalism was wonderful. Now, for most analysts of world affairs, the end of this golden age, if you call it golden, coincides with the departure of John Holmes from the Department of External Affairs. By the late 1950s, Europe had recovered, which meant that Canada's relative position in the world had diminished. Conservative criticism of the Liberals' alleged abandonment of the empire over the Suez Crisis had ended any sense of nonpartisanship that might have existed in foreign policy earlier. The public, egged on by a national media that had indeed embraced gotcha journalism, thanks in part to the many liberal scandals of the mid-1950s, the public increased its expectations of Canada. You could call this the Nobel Prize syndrome. The moment Pearson won that Nobel Prize, the expectation of the Canadian public wasn't only that Canada would do more good, but it was that it would win more Nobel Prizes. And the expectations were ratcheted up to a level that really could not be met by a country with the size and stature of Canada in world affairs. In the meantime, what's happening to John Holmes? Let's come back to his life for a moment. As a result of a brief affair with the Russian man that occurred when he was posted to Moscow in the late 1940s, Holmes finds himself in the late 1950s caught up in what are called the gay purges of the civil service that are conducted by the RCMP in the late 50s and into the early 60s. The way that it worked was as follows. In the 1930s, when the communists were looking for spies in Canada, they looked for communist sympathizers. There were enough. They could convince them to spy in Canada. But I've told you that by the mid-1940s, nobody in Canada likes the communists anymore. But the Soviets are still looking for spies. So what they do is they look for people who they consider vulnerable. Homosexuality is a crime in Canada until 1969. As a result, being caught in a homosexual relationship could be very problematic for your career. So the communists target people they think might be or think they can prove are homosexuals or are in homosexual relationships and basically demand that they spy or else they will reveal their sexual orientation. Like many other skilled public servants caught in what Prime Minister Brian Mulroney later condemned as one of the more odious episodes in Canadian history, Holmes was interrogated by the RCMP in the middle of the night, was eventually forced to resign even though he was never accused and there was no evidence to suggest that he ever did compromise national security in any way. The irony of the story is that the loss of the Department of External Affairs was actually the rest of Canada's gain. And I'd argue Holmes had a greater impact on world affairs after he left the department than he did while he was there. And he begat this second golden age of Canadian foreign policy. Within a year of being purged from external, Holmes finds himself, by fluke of circumstances, Holmes would later suggest that he left external affairs to go back to the Canadian Institute of International Affairs. It's not true. When he left external, there was no job to go back to. But by fluke circumstance, the job as president opened up 3 months after he left external, and he basically moved back into a job he had left 17 years earlier, only a job that had much more prestige attached to it in 1960, thanks to Canada's reputation in the world than it did before. And over the next couple of decades, thanks in large part to Holmes, although certainly not all, some of the people who worked with him are here, and they deserve credit as well, public discussions of Canada's place in the world were dynamic, they were engaging, they were based on what I consider to be a reasonable understanding of Canada's past. So at the level of public diplomacy and understanding then, the mid to late 1960s through the part of the 1970s begets a second golden age. There were academic conferences, as there certainly are today. The difference is that academic conferences under John Holmes were widely reported in the press. You didn't have to seek out the media sought them out. They included a better mix of university professors, policy practitioners, current and retired politicians, and enthusiastic young students. There was none of this idea of banning your ministers from making any public comments without clearing it with the PMO first. Holmes believed strongly that the Institute could foster the cross-community dialogue that was necessary, and he believed it was necessary, to build coherent strategic policy that could be explained to and supported by the general Canadian public. And I'd suggest to you that he was more successful than most before and since in making that happen. Doesn't mean he was fully successful, but more successful than most. At his busiest, Holmes was accepting well over 50 engagements a year to speak and comment on world affairs in venues such as this, and he didn't discriminate. There'd be international meetings of policy experts, there would be military colleges, there would be high school Model United Nations assemblies. In fact, a couple of times Holmes turns down opportunities to speak at Yale and a couple other major American institutions because a high school in Toronto wants him to speak there, and he's really committed to the students more than anyone else. His writing on Canada and world affairs could be found in literally every notable academic journal, in major Canadian newspapers and magazines, in his own books and his own collections of essays. For over 20 years, he could be seen and heard regularly on CBC radio and also on CBC television. So what I'm suggesting to you is there was this period where foreign policy seemed to matter in Canada, and it had a clear, well-intentioned and well-informed voice at the front of it in John Holmes. That's not to say that everyone agreed with him, and once again, if you didn't agree with Holmes, it wasn't a golden age of foreign policy for you at this period. And I'll suggest to you later that for that reason, we may not want to go back to an age like that again. But for many, for Holmes' students who agreed with this point of view, for those who were brought up with a moderate approach to world affairs, this was absolutely a golden time. Among the themes that came out of Holmes' writings and teachings during the period are some that are worth repeating for you today. Here's one. Our influence, he once said, depends on the energetic affirmation of a policy of protecting and advancing our interests by collective action. Even though he believed in this collective action, even though he believed in aggressively championing Canadian interests, he despised foreign policy whose end was the attainment of international recognition. Let me explain to you. The pressure to put a Made in Canada label on our activities is self-defeating, he once said. Insofar as Canada has achieved a reputation in world politics, it has been as a country using its particular advantages in the interest of the world community, not for the projection of its own image. We have a delegation well fitted to make a worthy contribution, but we shall have to take a good deal of this on faith, because it is by nature discreet. We ought not to judge their success by the number of headlines that they receive. On the idea of Canada as a middle power, Holmes later said, we serve best and are liked best when we are responsible and sensible, inventive and tolerant, because we do not want to be a great power, but are content to fulfill a function that is unique and essential, but modest and appropriate. In response to those that might have criticized him then and would criticize him now for not taking the idea of leadership seriously enough, this is what Holmes said, because he heard this fairly often. He said, discretion in diplomacy is not incompatible with boldness of initiative in foreign policy, or even with dramatic moves in international politics. The discretion is the calculation of the issues at stake and the forces which can be mustered. Above all, it lies in the recognition of contradiction and the acceptance of paradox. The late 1960s, in addition to his speaking commitments and his role at the Institute, Holmes also became a university professor, and thereby opened up a new generation of young people to the informed study of Canada's place in the world. In 1968, if you were a graduate student anywhere other than Halifax and you wanted to take a graduate course in Canadian foreign policy, you could not, because there weren't any. And the one in Halifax wasn't a graduate course, it was an undergraduate course that Dennis Steers was letting graduate students into because there were no graduate courses. If you wanted to take international affairs, there was a course by James Ayres in Toronto, which dealt with Canadian foreign policy occasionally, and there was a fourth-year course by Frederick Soward out at UBC, and that was all. So when Holmes comes on the scene, teaching a course at the University of Toronto, and then 2 undergraduate courses at Glendon College, one of them, students of one of them who are here today, things change dramatically. Access to the study of Canada in world affairs increases exponentially. On top of that, Holmes is an excellent teacher. His classes were known for the active engagement of their participants, the deep relationships they developed between Holmes and his students, many of whom kept in touch long after they left his class. At the time, there was very little teaching done in universities through what now everybody knows as the case study method. Holmes was one of the pioneers, particularly in the social sciences and humanities, of using this case study method. Now it's used so regularly. So again, there was something golden for many about this time. The study of Canada and world affairs, relatively speaking, flourished in that it went from nothing to something. And with it came an outpouring of popular and academic publications. Holmes, the teacher, stressed the importance of clear and accessible writing and analysis that led to realistic policy options. He encouraged his students to appreciate the contending and often contradictory forces that challenged and limited policymakers on the world stage. He absolutely despised empty rhetoric. He was much less interested in foreign policy glory than he was in foreign policy outcomes. This is how he once explained it. Canada itself is basically a framework within which diverse people can live secure, prosperous, and non-republican lives. The function of our state is peace, order, and good government. In my view, a thoroughly modern approach to statehood, if not exciting. We are not, and never were, intended to be a nation-state or a bearer of mission. Our approach to government is functional, not messianic. Holmes understood that the nature of conflict and the nature of world order was evolving. He was the first mainstream Canadian foreign policy analyst and one of the first mainstream international policy analysts to recognize the importance of the environment to national and international security. And it's actually quite humorous to watch him trying to explain to his colleagues why the environmental scientists should be invited to speak at the political science conferences. He argued that they had a perspective and an idea that was critical to world order, and it was time for academics of different disciplines to understand each other's languages and to understand the issues that they were facing. So at one level, he was unbelievably progressive. At another level, however, he was a traditionalist. He didn't believe in academic theory. He believed in clear writing. He didn't believe in texts that were written for publication. He believed in texts that were written to make a difference. By the late 1970s, the foreign policy landscape in Canada had begun to change. There were new approaches to studying Canadian foreign policy, many of which indeed advanced academic thinking well beyond what John Holmes would have been capable of. There was a much greater divergence of views. There was a greater diversity of thinking. At the same time, there was much less practical experience informing the classroom experience. So I don't want to wish to suggest that we should yearn to go back to that time. I think the critical theorists and many people who study Canadian foreign policy have made significant contributions that they weren't making in the 60s and 70s. But if you liked Holmes's approach, and if you liked what he was saying, and a lot of people did, the 60s and 70s, again, were unbelievably golden. When Holmes passed away after a battle with cancer in 1988, he had given well over 500 public speeches on Canadian foreign policy. He had taught hundreds of senior-level undergraduate and graduate students at the University of Toronto. He had published over 100 articles and books in academic publications. He'd been awarded the Tyrrell Medal for a lifetime of contributions to Canadian history, even though he didn't have a PhD in Canadian history and never taught a course in his life in Canadian history. He'd been elected as a fellow to the Royal Society of Canada. He'd received 11 honorary degrees, including one from the United States. He'd been named to the Order of Canada. His influence on the development of and teaching of Canadian foreign policy in the post-war period was and will remain unprecedented. In other words, there is no John Holmes today. Regardless of whether one agrees with whether there should be or with his views, Canada absolutely lacks that singular voice and unheralded public leadership that he so eloquently provided for a very long period. 21st century students, not to mention political leaders and policy practitioners, could learn a lot from his calm and rational approach to international conflict, from his staunch faith in the role of diplomacy and negotiation, from his commitment to teaching and to mentorship, and from his unwavering loyalty to his country. So coming back to this original question that I've been asked to talk about today, is the golden age of Canadian foreign policy behind us? One level, the answer is probably yes. Given the changes in global politics in the last 65 years, it is doubtful that Canadians will ever be blessed or cursed with the international circumstances conducive to another golden era. And it is equally unlikely that one individual will ever dominate foreign policy discussion the way that John Holmes did. If, however, we were to try to bring back some sense of goldenness, we would have a lot of work to do in this country. A new golden age would require Canadian foreign policy to stop falling prey to populist, or what we could call today provincialist, clamors for independence. It would have to stop being full of so much partisan bickering and impulsive emotional outbursts that lead us nowhere. As was the case in Holmes's diplomatic era, Canadian leaders would have to be willing to assign the responsibility for grand strategy formulation to some of the country's best and most creative thinkers and give them the freedom to do their jobs. They'd have to cooperate with their opposites in the House of Commons. They'd have to encourage and attract instead of discourage the most talented Canadians from entering the public service. And they'd have to focus unselfishly on long-term interests for which they could show the public no immediate results before the next election. They would only be successful, even if they did all this, if their partners in the media asked the hard questions that could teach Canadians about strategic thinking, and if the national public acknowledged the benefits of allowing the experts the flexibility necessary to do their jobs effectively. These latter factors would be made a heck of a lot easier if the country as a whole gained a more comprehensive grasp of its national history, and if members of the academic community communicated much more effectively, not only with the public elite, but with the public as a whole. My group needs to write better, there's no question. In other words, a renaissance is not entirely impossible, but we should not underestimate the truly exceptional talent of Holmes and his cohort and in their efforts to improve the understanding of Canada and its place in the world and make it more accessible to interested Canadians. Thanks very much.